set.
Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Jeremy Schrader. I'm the Executive Director of Common Cause. With me today is Tom Horner, the 2010 gubernatorial candidate for the Independence Party. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to the conversation.
Well, me too. I was hoping that the Supreme Court would make a different decision and overturn Citizens United so we could talk about more fun things
Right.
like the weather here. But unfortunately, for those of you that aren't familiar, today is the fourth anniversary of the Citizens United decision from the Supreme Court, stating that, well, reaffirming that money is speech,
Right.
and that corporations are people. So what that has allowed in the 4 years since the decision has just been this kind of onslaught of money for independent expenditures. We're just seeing increases in absolutely every single kind of level of race.
Right. And what some people overlook is that for many years the flow of money was in every cycle increasing by leaps and bounds, and a lot of it coming from entities like corporations and interest groups and unions. What Citizens United really did was take that trend and just put it on steroids and really ramp it up. Secondly, made it easier to avoid disclosure and the transparency that is so important. And thirdly, allowed a lot of these different entities to move from what maybe could pass as education and some soft communications to very aggressive advocacy and very direct communications, that now has put even races at local levels on an all the time 24/7 365 day a year cycle. I mean, there's never a time when a public office holder is not campaigning for office.
No, that's a great point. I think just to start this off, I think if you could talk a little bit about, maybe your run in 2010 and when, Citizens United was first decided,
Sure.
and maybe describe some of the kind of what the lifting of the limits had done to your campaign.
Sure. Well, so in 2010, I decided to run for governor of Minnesota as an Independence Party candidate, and went in with eyes wide open. I mean, knew just how challenging it is for a third party to take on the challenge of running for office, but thought that at a minimum there ought to be a better conversation in Minnesota around some of the really critical issues that the state faces. And so, well, went into it with the hope and the goal of winning. Also thought that just being a candidate and forcing debates and holding the other candidates accountable would have some value. And a couple of things that I ran into. One is that in direct response to Citizens United, 2010 really saw the creation of some new kinds of interest groups and a huge acceleration of the flow of interest money, corporate dollars, union dollars into the campaigns for both the Republican and the Democratic candidates. And a couple of things happened. People sometimes overlook that in the general election, from the primary in August until election day in November, on contributions from individual Minnesotans, our campaign actually competed very favorably with Mark Dayton and Tom Emmer, dollar for dollar, on contributions from individual Minnesotans during the general election. What we couldn't compete with was the huge amount of money that came from Minnesota and national interest during that general election that just really changed the dynamics of the campaign, the kind of conversation we were able to have with Minnesotans. But the other thing that unless you're really involved in the campaign and you understand the mechanics of the campaign, it's always been the case that nothing is more valuable to a candidate, particularly someone who's challenging from the outside, than early money. I mean, being able to at a time when people are starting to pay attention, to be able to define yourself and to develop your relationship with the voters and state your issues, and to do that early before all of these interests come in and define you is just so critical. That's what I really lost out on is that while Minnesota has, I think, a pretty good system of public financing for candidates, particularly at the level of governor. That money doesn't come to the candidate until 3, 4, 5 weeks after the primary election. Well, by that time, the Democrats and the Republicans, on a daily basis over the period of several weeks, flooded the mailbox of every swing voter in the state with a tax on me. One day from the Republicans, one day from the Democrats, some days from both. And by the time I had the money to say, here's who Tom Horner is, here's why I'm running, here's what I'm all about, those candidates had pretty much defined me and defined themselves. And the challenge for a third party candidate is pretty quickly you have to move into second place and be perceived as somebody who can win. Otherwise, fear takes over. And that's exactly what happened in 2010 as Mark Dayton and Tom Emmer moved farther away from each other. There were so many Democrats who thought, boy, I like Horner, but I really am worried about Tom Emmer becoming governor, and Republicans who said the same thing but worried about Mark Dayton becoming governor. And as long as I was stuck in third place, fear became the driver, and a lot of that is driven by money.
Well, that having lived through that and run, very, personally gone through that, when you had time to reflect, I'm assuming some sleep as well.
Yes.
What did you think? What did you think would happen after the Citizens United, that election cycle? What did you think the political landscape would look like in the future?
Oh, I think that it has turned out very much what I feared it would look like, because all of the incentives, frankly, for those in power are not to make changes, not to do anything that would disrupt that money. What we are seeing is, frankly, the organized political parties and candidates themselves in their campaigns actually having less influence, and all of these different interests having much more influence in the kinds of issues that are elevated as well as the solutions that are put out there. So while I think myself and a lot of other folks had hoped that we would have some substantive reform in terms of requiring more transparency and disclosure of contributions, and those kinds of things, as well as some changes in how money is collected and those issues. And then lastly, some changes in public funding of campaigns is just too hard, I think, to break through all of the vested interests, starting with Republicans and Democrats, unless and until Minnesotans and citizens in other states stand up and say, we deserve better. We deserve more robust conversations in our campaigns and more accountability from our office holders.
Well, that brings up a really important point. What do you think that would take? I mean, over these last couple of years, we've just seen a lot of media about how angry the community is, how unpopular the Citizens United decision has become. But yet, there hasn't been that tipping point. Like, what do you think it would take?
I think a couple of things. One, and certainly I have a vested interest in saying this, so I understand that, but I do think that there is value in having strong third parties, in having alternative voices, or in having strong organizations, Common Cause being one of them, that are out there raising the issue and raising the consequences and elevating the kinds of impact that it has on the issues that are discussed and the solutions that are viable. And so having those organizations to engage and educate people and give them a channel for driving change, I think, is important. Secondly, I think that we need to look at political reform comprehensively. And so it's important for people to look not just at how campaigns are financed, which is important, but I think movements like the ranked choice voting. So we had a pretty good experience in Minneapolis last fall in the mayoral election. I think ranked choice voting, allowing all votes to count, giving a way for all votes to be meaningful, I think becomes an important antidote to the flow of money to get behind that. I think we need to make sure that the system doesn't get any worse, and so stop further damage. So an issue that Common Cause has been instrumental in, that I care a lot about, making sure that on our judiciary, that we don't do the kinds of things that we've seen in other states, where now all of a sudden we have huge amounts of money going into judicial elections, and we start to compromise our courts. I think that would be a horrible situation. And I think the fourth thing that is going to happen and is going to be a catalyst for change is a tragedy, and that is we're going to have a scandal. Something's going to happen that will cause people to pay attention and to say, wait a second, that crosses the line. Enough is enough. And unfortunately, I think it's just a matter of time before something really unfortunate happens in an election or in a public policy making process that finally gets people's attention and motivates them to act.
Well, I think that's really interesting, because until you get to that fourth one, I'm like, well, my question was, what's going to make people
Right.
act? All of the things that you mentioned, and you've been way too kind to Common Cause, and I appreciate that. But all of those already exist.
Right.
But your fourth point about a scandal, my follow-up question would be, Citizens United, as you've said already, has made ways that there aren't kind of disclosure of, who these donors are.
Right.
Which would be the primary way to find out a scandal and to be made public. What other ways that would be my fear. When you say scandal, what exactly do you mean?
I think there could be a scandal where we see, maybe it's the retribution of an office holder exacting revenge on others. New Jersey comes to mind.
I just like the Stillwater Bridge.
Well, right. Could be something like that. Or I think it could be people saying, wait a second, what is happening right now is a scandal. We just haven't been paying
Right.
attention to it. And so, there was a fabulous article in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago that took a look at the impact of national money in very local races, highlighting a couple of legislative races in Minnesota as cases in point, where in some cases a fourth to a third of the total amount of money that a candidate for the Minnesota legislature spent came from national special interests driving very narrow, very, very specific issues and solutions. Now, frankly, some of those I agree with, some of those I disagree with on the issue. What I absolutely oppose is that Minnesotans lose control of their legislature, of who represents them. That's what money is doing. And so I think the scandal already is out there. It's, now we need to get people to pay attention to what are the consequences of that. Look at the tradition we've had in Minnesota in particular, where we really value, for better or worse, having 330 school districts around the state where local people have the say over how their schools are run. And we don't like it when the state, or even worse, when the federal government comes in and says, school districts, you have to do this or you have to do that. We want those local school boards because we want our neighbors making that kind of policy. City councils, we don't want state government or the federal government saying you have to zone this way or that way. We want control over how our communities develop and take shape. And so we put high value on the election of citizen governors to a school board, to a city council, who are going to make decisions as neighbors working on behalf of neighbors. What's happening with the amount of money coming into local races erodes all of that. It absolutely moves from a person having allegiance to a neighbor to having allegiance to the national group that's providing the money. It wasn't much of an issue when legislative races, were more about shoe leather than the amount of money in your pocketbook or your wallet. In 2012, we had legislative races in Minnesota where the total amount of spending in the two campaigns exceeded $500,000 for legislative races. That's a scandal. It's how do we get people to pay attention to it, and I think it's going to happen.
well, just a couple more questions.
Yeah.
Kind of the overturning Citizens United is kind of a longer term goal that Common Cause has. But in the meantime, I think there are numerous reforms. You've mentioned a couple here
Mhm.
today. What are some that kind of come to mind as seen as the right steps forward, kind of an immediate way to counteract the effects of Citizens United?
Yeah, I think again in Minnesota we have some good processes, um, but it is a bit of a disjointed system, and so now we do give individual contributors to local campaigns, to legislative campaigns, to statewide campaigns, a rebate up to $100 or $50, $100 for a couple, on contributions to local candidates. We have on our tax form checkoffs to help public financing. I think all of those kinds of activities are good, but we have to be a bit careful, and again, my bias, that we're not doing the kinds of things that disproportionately support those parties that are most established, those parties that already have a network of contributors, have the means to get out and leverage those kinds of things. So I also like putting more money into public funding and figuring out a way, and I don't have the solution, but figuring out a way to expedite that money to a candidate. So in 2010, as a third party candidate, I had to show that I could raise money by the middle of July, so early in the campaign cycle,
Hmm.
from at least 700 Minnesotans in increments of no more than $50. That's a pretty high bar. I mean,
Hmm.
that says, okay, this is a viable candidate. This is a candidate who has a broad base of support. And once I was able to do that and then won the primary, I qualified for, I think I ended up getting a little over $400,000, in part because Mark Dayton chose not to accept public funding, and so a share of his money that he would have received came to me. But as the third party, we had a smaller pot,
Hmm.
a high bar, but also the critical need for early money. I think public funding has to figure out answers to those three. How do you put a little more money into it? How do you get it sooner? And how do you make sure that you're not setting a bar that is so high that you disproportionately disadvantage third party candidates,
Hmm.
while at the same time requiring third party candidates to show that they do have a broad base of
Hmm.
support. I also think that we ought to have immediate disclosure. I think that campaigns, again, in my campaign in 2010, a contribution came into the campaign office. The first thing somebody did was you enter it into the computer.
Hmm.
It's already in your database. To simply then go that extra step to make it public and to say, look, today I received these contributions, I think is important. And I think it ought to be every contribution, whether it's a $10 gift or a $1,000 gift. I think every contribution ought to be publicly disclosed on a candidate's website before that candidate can spend that dollar, and do it in real time and do it immediately, because right now we have those windows where you can game the system, and candidates can get big contributions at the 11th hour that don't get disclosed until after voters have made their decisions, and that's not right. So I'd like to see some of those kinds of things. Now I'd also, and I know this is an area where maybe Common Cause and I differ, I think we ought to at least explore raising the limits on contributions to individual candidates. And while that sounds counterintuitive, that it would put even more money into campaigns and politics, at least it puts it into the hands of those who are most accountable. I mean, it's the candidate's name on the ballot. It's the candidate who's required to file. It's the candidate who's held accountable by our campaign election board, or campaign financing board. I, I think if you can create opportunities for less money in the special interest groups, even if it means more money overall in campaigns, I think in the end that's a good thing. And then the last thing, again, to reiterate, is that it's not just about reforming the way campaigns are funded. It's how we elect people. It's making sure that we hold them accountable to show up at debates. It's how the media cover campaigns, and it's how we as citizens take our responsibility seriously to really be meaningful players in campaigns, to be informed citizens.
Sure. Well, on many of those, I mean, we do differ on some, but agree with some, many of those. But one thing that, you know, obviously Common Cause has not been great on picking the winners. A lot of those reforms have been proposed and haven't been adopted in the 4 years. And I just wanted to get kind of your, besides the upping of the candidate limits, what has been kind of the holdup, or in your opinion, what's by having this reform?
Well, I think it becomes a self-fulfilling process that money blocks controls on money because they have what they want right now. I mean, they have a louder voice in the political process than individual citizens, than that contributor who can give $10, $20, $50, even $1,000. The interest groups that are coming in are able to dump huge amounts of money, and frankly, candidates have to pay attention to that. You know, the other thing that's happening is so many of the special interests are really designed to be attack dogs, to undermine confidence in government. And again, I mean, we're seeing this now almost from election day to election day. And so in Minnesota legislative races, you know, in 2014, Minnesotans will elect the House of Representatives, 134 members. We've been seeing direct mail attack pieces against incumbent members of the legislature for the last year, since this time a year ago, at the beginning of their terms. You know, it's nonstop now. And I think that undermines the confidence in government to find solutions to campaigns. And so, again, I mean, at the end of the day, we need individuals willing to step up and say enough is enough, and make campaign finance reform and political reform a part of how they evaluate candidates. And as we think about electing a governor this year and electing the House of Representatives, part of what citizens, I hope, will do is to say, how do you feel about campaign finance reform? Are you really willing to take on those interests? Can I count on you? And then hold them accountable to following through on those actions.
Well, great. We're nearing the end of our interview. Do you have anything else you wanted to add?
No, just, you know, thanks to you for having this conversation, and to Common Cause for the work that you're doing. And I'd also say, just as a final word to those who are watching, you know, spread the word. I mean, take this and share the link with people. Have conversations, raise it in discussions, and really go that extra step and think about attending your caucuses in February and March, and being part of the process. That, in the end, is what's going to make the difference.
Well, Tom, I want to thank you so much for being here, and
A
thank
pleasure.
you for everything.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Yep, thanks.